Hi there. We are studying the great ones, great chapters in the Bible this year here at Grace. We're kind of working our way from the Old Testament through the New Testament, picking out key chapters that have really influenced the church over the decades and taking a look at them. So today we begin looking at the book of Hebrews. And this coming week and the following week, we will be in that wonderful book, looking at 4 chapters in total. Hebrews was written by an unknown author to the Jewish people. As I grew up in my faith, I always thought Paul wrote it and he just forgot to put his name in the book. But from what we know from scholars over time, both way back in the church age of the 2 and 300 AD up till today, the two most likely candidates that are believed to have been the author of Hebrews are Apollos, who you can read about in Acts chapter 18, and Barnabas. And the reasons for assuming it's them and not Paul is usually Paul attached his name to a letter. We know that there's some similarities between Paul's writings in the book of Hebrews, but the level of training of the author of Hebrews really shows a strong Jewish heritage, but also that he had tremendous knowledge of the Greek language. So that's why Apollos, who we read about in Acts 18:24, and Barnabas are thought to be the perspective, or possible, I'll say possible authors of this book. Both of them were friends of Paul, thus the similarities in the language, but both of them showed schooling, and we know about their schooling. It was much higher than what a number of the other people who wrote in the Bible had attained in terms of both knowledge of the Jewish faith and also the Greek language. So having said all of that, there's some things here in Hebrews that I can point out. The author of Hebrews knew Timothy, and both Apollos and Barnabas and Paul knew Timothy. He was not an eyewitness of Jesus. We see that in chapter 2, verses 1, and also in chapter 3. The letter was probably written before the Jewish temple was destroyed, and it was written to Jewish Christians, those people who had left the Christian faith and had gone on, who had left the Jewish faith and had gone on to the Christian faith. It was a tremendous time of upheaval and persecution as the church was growing. If the early church was really persecuted by the stalwart Jewish people. If a person left the Jewish faith into the Christian faith, they stood to lose everything. They'd lose definitely their faith. They'd lose the faith in the sense of being able to practice with other Jewish people and be around them. They would lose support of the Jewish community, especially if they were a businessman, business person. That would be a tremendous shock to them. But also, if their family had not become believers, then they would be ostracized by their family. So the writer of Hebrews is addressing the Jewish people who through the language of the book really knows these people well. He understands what they're going through. It's somebody who has actually seen the people that he's writing to. We learn that in chapter 13, verse 19. The author knew them, wanted to get back to see them. So it's definitely somebody that had some connection to Jewish people, and particularly ones that he's writing to. The author encourages the people, these are Jewish Christians again, in faithfulness, in love, and in sound doctrine. And he does so by really looking at the Old Testament. So this was not a fly-by-night, if you will, author. It's somebody who really understood the Jewish faith, probably had grown up in the Jewish faith, and now he's making a comparison between the Jewish system of belief and also the Christian system of faith. It's brand new. The Jewish people who have become believers don't quite understand all the intricacies, so the author here is explaining this to them. You could say Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, has 3 primary purposes. For my love of alliteration, I'll use the letter C. First is this: Christ is greater than any angel, any priest, any old covenant practice, any aspect of the Jewish faith. Very early in the book of Hebrews, the author points us out. Jesus is better than anything that the Jews could possibly want to hold on to. Second C word is Christians. He's encouraging not to forsake their faith, not to forsake the salvation that Christ had brought to them. And the author of Hebrews points out that Jesus died once and once for all the sins. Whereas the Jewish faith, you had to keep killing an animal, spreading its blood, and that would only cover your sins. So again, he wants these Christians to not be afraid and to stand up for what they believe. And it's often easy for new Christians to shirk back if any pressure is added to them. So Christ, Christians, and then the third C is the church. He really points out that the church is essential to our Christian faith. And he's not talking this about a building, because they didn't have buildings and property back then, but the church is people, about the fellow believers. And if you left the Jewish faith, you're on your own. So it was critical that they hang together and that they encourage one another, and they would live out their Christian faith in community. So those three things need to be emphasized in our own culture today, that Christ is greater than anything that we could ever have. He offers hope, he offers forgiveness, he offers eternal salvation. Christians, we're undergoing persecution even here in America. It's not like it is in other countries, but yet the government is pushing us in pushing our faith out of all aspects of civil life. And we have to hold on to that faith. We have to propagate the faith, because if we go quiet, the rest of the world continues on its way to hell with nobody to step in. And the church is essential to our faith. Community is critical. So we have to understand the importance of being together in our home groups, but also in our corporate worship. We have to understand the importance of serving, the importance of serving in the church, but also as a church, whether it's a small group of people or the entire church, serving in our local community. So the background of all of these exhortations, if you will, the idea that Christ is greater than everything, Christians have to hang in there, endure the suffering and the persecution, and the church is essential to our faith. These exhortations, if you will, they address the people's needs that they have to continue to endure in spite of any persecution. And if you go to chapter 12 of Hebrews, you can read about that. What has happened here with the Hebrew Christians and what has happened here with American Christians because of this whole COVID thing, government pushing, stripping us of not only our civilian freedoms, but the freedoms that God has given us. The Christians are backing down. They appear to have grown, if you will, less attentive to the basic Christian doctrines. Chapter 5, verse 11 through 14 points this out. It's like they're babies. They haven't moved forward. They're not really practicing their faith. They're just coasting along with the flow, depending on whether their family dictates their behavior or the government dictates their behavior or their own personal whims. They've grown less attentive to living the Christian life. They're coasting. Also, they had ceased to, if you will, in their regular attendance and community with each other. They began to go it alone. And we know ourselves that anytime you go alone, you risk failure, you risk not having any accountability, you risk setting yourself up as a little God, and you also risk attack by those who would seek to destroy the movement of Christianity. So again, the encouragement deals with all of that. They have to start living what they say they believe, and they have to begin living in community and sharing life. So if we want to look at the book of Hebrews, there's 5 things that we can take note of. It's number 1, a book of evaluation. You read the book of Hebrews, it forces you to take a good look at yourself. Now, one of the things that when I first read Hebrews, I was amazed at the depth of thought and even the language used. It's a rarity today in our American culture to talk to anybody who thinks deeply and can express themselves profoundly. We've dumbed down the American education to the point we're pretty happy if all we can do is grunt. And the American population as a whole doesn't think much more beyond what the media, the government, or some teacher has told them. We just accept things as facts and we don't go below the surface. Well, Hebrews is a book of evaluation. It forces us to think deeper. And this is, and I'm being honest here, this is a hard book for most Americans to really read and understand because we don't think on that level very often. We're just used to getting by. Everything is good enough in terms of our education. One of the things we see in the book of Hebrews is the word better. It's used 13 times in the book, and the author shows how Jesus, if you will, and Christian salvation is better than anything that the Jewish people had or could offer. It points out that Jesus is better than the angels in chapter 1, verse 4. He has brought a better hope, chapter 7, verse 9, and he's provided a better covenant based on better promises in chapter 8, verse 6. So as you study through Hebrews, if you're going to read the whole book, just look for the word better and circle it, and you begin to see the encouragement that Paul is giving people. Hey, look, Christianity is a really good deal. We're always motivated by, is this a better product than the other product? We think in terms of, will this administration be better than the prior administration? Is mom's cake better than my wife's cake? Whatever it may be. We as Americans are looking at ways to evaluate because we want the good in life. And the author here says that Jesus is the best. The author contrasts the Old Testament system of religion with the New Testament system of grace, law versus grace throughout this book. Remember, they were tempted to return to what was comfortable, to what was convenient, to what they knew. And sometimes we in the faith, that when pressure increases, we're tempted to take the easy road. And I think we all understand what that means. So the book forces us to look at our life and say, am I growing? Am I trusting Christ or am I trusting myself in terms of making decisions? Am I trusting God's will for my life or am I trying to get an easy way to live life? So all of that is said about the book of evaluation. Secondly, it's a book of exhortation, and if you will, the idea of someone pushing you, nudging you to do better and go farther than what you have. The author states this in chapter 13 and in verse 22. The book opens with an important exhortation in chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. It's really highlighting for us the fact that God has spoken. It uses those words. And if God has spoken, you and I should respond. Towards the end of the book in chapter 12:25, it says that, see to it that you do not refuse him who speaks. So he starts off the book saying that these are the words of God. And then towards the end of the book, he says, don't refuse, don't be hesitant, move forward with what God is telling you to do. Sometimes we all need to be exhorted. We've all had a teacher, a coach, an employer, a parent, a grandparent who exhorted us to be better, do better, go further than what we have. And that's what Hebrews does. They had settled for mediocrity. They had settled for being average. And here at Grace, I've been talking a lot about the term good enough. They settled to be just good enough, to just be religious. And if we settle to be just good enough, we're going to backslide when the pressure comes upon us. Thirdly, it's a book of examination. It not only evaluates where we are in life, but it helps us to look deeper into our life and examine ourselves, much like a doctor would or a medical person. And as I read through Hebrews, I ask myself, what am I really trusting in? Am I trusting in my position? Hey, I'm a pastor. That's good enough, right? Am I trusting in my employment? Because we're learning that others now are telling you what you can or cannot do and whether you actually can have a job or not. Are you trusting in that job? Well, that job may not be there. Are you trusting in individuals? Individuals come and individuals go in our life. Is our faith based upon what mommy and daddy have taught us? or what some religious person has, or is our faith dependent upon my trust, my belief, my commitment to the promises of God? So we really get to examine ourselves and say, am I just good enough, or am I actually moving forward? So we not only evaluate where we are, we look deeper into why I am where I'm at, if that makes sense to you. Fourth thing, it's a book of expectation. Throughout the book, we're told not to focus on the world, but on eternity. In other words, not where you are, but where you want to be, and more importantly, where God wants you to be. All through the book, we see examples of this given, but particularly in chapter 11, when it says the patriarchs of old were looking forward to a future city of God. They understood they were just passing through this life. They never made planet Earth their world. They looked beyond it. And what I see in many American churchgoers is that this is good enough. Earth is my heaven. This is what I live for. And you can always evaluate and see where you are in your life by looking at where your thoughts are, your time, your talents, your treasures. The writer here of Hebrews is forcing them, if you will, that to move their expectation from planet Earth to that heavenly city, to eternity with God. So it again forces you and I to, what are we expecting in life? Either this world is all there is, or heaven is, if you will, the pot at the end of the rainbow. We're either living at one end of the rainbow or at the other. So the expectation is in your thinking, as you look at those four words I just mentioned, what do you spend your time thinking about? What do you spend your treasure on? Where are you investing your time when you have free time on planet Earth? And then your talents, all those four T words. That shows where our expectation is. We're either looking at planet Earth or we're looking beyond. And lastly, it's a book of exaltation. In other words, exalt means to lift up. And the author of this book keeps talking about Jesus, 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 Jesus. He's exalting Jesus as his Lord, as his King, as his Creator. And as we walk through Hebrew, we see that he talks about Jesus being the Creator, the great prophet, a priest, a king, and ultimately he is God. It says in chapter 1 and verse 3, the first part of verse 3, the sun is the radiance of God's glory. I love the way he wrote that. It's the radiance of God's glory. In other words, here's God, and if you want to know what God's like, you look at Jesus. He says Jesus is the exact representation of the Father's being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. He lifts Jesus up in his life. He has a very high view of who Jesus is. Jesus was not just one of the guys. He was not just a good teacher. He was more than that. He was God in human flesh, showing us what the Father is like and how a believer in the Father is supposed to live. With all that said and done, I just want to end this looking at chapter 1, chapter 2, and point out 4 verses that stood out to me. Okay, and I don't know how you're studying this, whether you're doing this alone, as a family, in a home group, but here's some verses that if I were in a home group, I would want to talk about. First is Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 3. It says, the sun is the radiance of God's glory in the exact representation of his being. I just read that. And then sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty in heaven. That verse just gets me to think about and want to talk about my view of who Jesus is. He's the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation. When I look at the stories of Jesus in the Gospels, what do I learn about God? That's what I would talk about using Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 3. Hebrews chapter 1 verse 14 is a question. It says this, are not all angels ministering spirits sent to serve those who will inherit salvation? It leads us to believe in guardian angels, if you will. And I've always said I want to meet an angel before I die. That would be totally the bomb for me. But it says, the question is, are not all angels, ministering spirits. And I guess over the years, I've sort of missed the point that all angels are ministering spirits. Does that mean that every Christian has a guardian angel? If so, that angel is with you all of the time. What does that angel hear you say? What does he watch you do? And then think of how bruised some of our angels are just from our driving habits. And maybe they're going, can I, get a new one here, Michael or Gabriel? This guy is crazy. He's a crazy driver. Give me somebody else that maybe isn't as wild as he is. I don't know. But they're ministering spirits. They're there to help you. And I wonder how many of us are aware of that each day of our life. Now we know God's Spirit is within us, but He's given us an angel to serve us and help us. You might want to think about that and have a discussion about that. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 1 is my third verse that I would want to talk about. It says, we must pay the most careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard so that we do not drift away. That's a great verse. It's the idea of being good enough. He says you don't want to just settle for being good enough and drift away in your faith, waste precious resources and opportunities, and you don't want to, we use the word backslide, fall away from your faith in God, where we end up living like babies and children when we should be mature in our faith. That's Hebrews 2:1. Hebrews 2:18 is the last verse that I'll share. It says, because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. And just the idea of temptation, and how does the fact that somebody suffered when he was tempted? Remember, Jesus was tempted to sin, and he suffered. You might want to talk about what that may have been in his life. How then is he able to help us when we are tempted? That's a great point for discussion. This hopefully will give you some insight into the great book of Hebrews. Hopefully you understood some of what I talked about, but also 4 key verses to guide your thinking this week in chapters 1 and 2, but also to guide your discussion. All right? Hey, God bless. See you Sunday.